The gate post split clean down the middle on a Tuesday, and Bessie Talmadge stood in her doorway watching Marshall Haskins drive his wagon away without once looking back, and she felt something crack inside her chest that had nothing to do with rotted cedar wood. She had watched him come and go for 12 months now. 12 times he had appeared at the boundary of her land like some kind of patient ghost, tools in hand, never asking for payment, never asking for anything at all. 12 times she had pressed herself against the inside of her front door and refused to speak to him, refused to invite him in, refused to let herself be the woman she suspected she still could be if someone gave her half a reason to try. And now it was the 13th month, and the gate post he had spent the better part of an autumn afternoon repairing last October had split again, and Bessie was standing on her porch in the copper light of a dying afternoon in September of 1882 with her heart hammering against her ribs because she had opened her mouth and the words had come out before she could stop them. She had called his name. She had said, "Mr. Haskins." He had turned. And in that turning, in the slow pivot of those broad shoulders and the way his hat brim tilted up so she could see his face for the first time in broad, honest daylight without the barrier of her own fear between them, Bessie Talmadge understood with the terrifying clarity of a woman who had spent 13 months building walls that she was standing at the edge of something she could not take back. She had said, "Would you come inside?" And now she was waiting for him to answer. The wind moved through the tall grass beyond the fence line. A crow lifted from the nearest post and sailed south without a sound. The wagon horse shifted its weight and blew a long breath through its nose. Marshall Haskins stood with one boot on the lowest fence rail and his hands loose at his sides, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been careful not to want too openly for a very long time. He said, "Yes, ma'am, I believe I would." This is where the story truly begins. But to understand what those 4 words cost both of them, you have to go back to the beginning, to the October morning 13 months earlier when a stranger with a wagon full of lumber and a reputation that carried its own dark weight arrived at the broken gate of the Talmadge homestead for the very first time. The town of Cutter's Fork, Texas sat about 40 miles southeast of Abilene in a flat, sun-hammered stretch of the Llano Estacado, where the sky was so enormous it made a person feel small in a way that was either humbling or terrifying, depending on the state of their heart. In 1881, Cutter's Fork had a population of 312 souls, a general store run by a man named Purvis Eckhart who weighed the scales in his favor when he thought he could get away with it, a sheriff's office that changed occupants the way other towns changed seasons, a Baptist church whose congregation spent more time discussing their neighbors' sins than their own, and a saloon called the Gilded Spur that was the truest parliament of information in the entire county. Bessie Talmadge was not a part of any of it. She had arrived in Cutter's Fork in March of 1879 as the wife of Clarence Talmadge, a land speculator from Missouri who had promised her a house and a future, and delivered instead a half-finished homestead 3 miles outside town, a life of relentless labor, and 2 years of marriage that had taught her the hard lesson that a man's promises in courtship and a man's behavior in marriage could be 2 entirely different countries with no road between them. Clarence Talmadge had not been a cruel man in the way that some men were cruel. He had not raised his hand to her. He had not gambled away their money at the Gilded Spur or spent his evenings in the company of other women. What Clarence had done was something quieter and in many ways more corrosive. He had simply stopped seeing her. He had looked through her the way a man looks through a window at the weather, registering her presence without ever truly encountering it. He had made her feel like a fixture in a house rather than the woman at the center of a life. When Clarence died of a fever in the spring of 1881, Bessie had done something that scandalized the women of Cutter's Fork and confused the men. She had grieved, genuinely and privately, not for the marriage she had lost, but for the marriage she had never had. She had cried in her kitchen for 3 days, And then she had dried her eyes and walked out to the land that was now entirely hers. And she had looked at the grass, and the sky and the sprawling imperfection of the homestead Clarence had never quite finished, and she had felt something unfamiliar settle into her bones. Relief. It was a terrible thing to feel about a dead husband, and Bessie knew it, and she kept it locked in the deepest room of herself where no one from Cutter's Fork could find it and use it against her. She was 28 years old. She had 160 acres of Texas land, a small herd of cattle she had no idea how to manage, a farmhand named Obie who was 70 years old and nearly blind in his left eye, and a gate post at the entrance to her property that had been leaning at a 20-degree angle since the summer before Clarence died. She had survived her first summer alone. She had sold 20 head of cattle through a broker in Abilene and used the money to winterize the house and buy enough feed to keep the remaining animals alive through January. She had learned to use a rifle well enough to discourage the coyotes that came for her chickens. She had repaired the roof of the barn herself with Obie watching from below and calling up concerned instructions that were half useful and half, simply the expressions of an old man who needed to feel he was contributing. She had done everything alone. She had made a virtue of alone, the way a person makes a virtue of the only thing they have. And then on the first Saturday of October in 1881, Marshall Haskins pulled his wagon up to her leaning gate post and stopped. Bessie was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon. She came to the window and looked out, and she saw a man she did not recognize climb down from the seat with the unhurried ease of someone completely comfortable in his own body. He was tall. She could see that much from the window. He wore a brown canvas work jacket and a hat that had been through enough weather to have real character, and he moved to the back of his wagon and began lifting out tools with the organized deliberateness of someone who had a specific job in mind. She watched him walk to her gate post. She watched him crouch beside it and run his hands along the wood the way a doctor runs his hands along a bone to find the break. She was out the front door before she had fully decided to go, and she stopped on the porch steps and said, "What do you think you are doing?" He looked up. He had a face that had been shaped by a lot of weather and a few difficulties, a face that was somewhere in its early 30s, she guessed, with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into the sun rather than from unhappiness. He had dark eyes that caught the light and held it without giving much back, and a jaw that was carrying 3 days of dark stubble. He said, "This post is rotted through at the base. You have got about 2 more good rainstorms in it before it falls over completely." "I have got the wood to replace it in my wagon," she said. "I did not ask you to replace it." He said, "No, ma'am, you did not." He said it without any edge in it, just a statement of plain fact delivered by a man who seemed entirely unmoved by her objection. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "Marshall Haskins. I work out at the Garrity spread 6 miles north. I pass this gate every time I come into town." She said, "And that gives you the right to come onto my property and start taking things apart." He paused with one hand on the gate post and looked at her with a directness that was not rude but was absolutely unflinching. He said, "I suppose it does not give me the right, no. But I have been watching this post lean further into the road for 6 months, and it seemed wasteful to keep watching it fall when I had the materials to fix it. I apologize for not asking first." He said it simply, like a man who knew he had overstepped and was willing to say so without it costing him his dignity. She had been prepared for defensiveness. She had been prepared for the particular brand of male condescension that took the form of explaining to a woman why he was doing something for her own good. She had not been prepared for a plain apology. She said, "What do you want for it?" He said, "Nothing," she said. "Men do not fix things for nothing." He looked at her steadily for a moment and then he said, "I reckon I'm not fixing it for nothing. I am fixing it because it needs fixing and I have the means to fix it. Those are my reasons." She stood on her porch steps for a long moment in which she could hear Obie somewhere around the back of the barn singing to himself in his cracked old voice, and the wind in the grass beyond the fence, and the whole enormous silence of the Llano Estacado pressing down on everything the way it always did. She said, "Be done before dark." She went back inside. She watched him from the kitchen window for 2 hours. He worked with the focused, methodical care of a man who took craftsmanship seriously. He dug out the rotted base of the old post first, clearing it all the way down to solid earth, and then he set the new post with a level. She watched him pull from a wooden box in his wagon, checking it from multiple angles before he began the work of bracing it. He cut the wood with a saw whose sound came through the closed window in long, clean strokes. He did not hurry. He did not waste motion. He worked the way Bessie imagined someone worked when they were doing a thing because it mattered to them rather than because someone was watching. When he was done, the post stood perfectly plumb in the fading afternoon light. He loaded his tools back into the wagon. He did not come to the door. He did not call out to her. He climbed up onto the wagon seat, clicked to his horse, and drove away north without looking back. Bessie stood in her kitchen long after the sound of the wagon had faded. She told herself it was nothing. A man with some spare wood and spare time who had made himself useful. It meant nothing. It required nothing from her. She told herself this very convincingly. Right up until the first Saturday of November, when the sound of a wagon came up from the road again. She was at the window faster this time than she wanted to admit to herself. Marshall Haskins. Same wagon. Same unhurried way of climbing down from the seat. He walked straight to the gate, and this time he looked over the whole fence line that ran along the road for 20 yards in either direction. He found the section of rail that had been weakened by the summer's heat and the first autumn rains. He replaced 3 sections of fencing with new-cut rails he had brought in the wagon bed. He worked for 3 hours. He did not come to the door. He drove away. Bessie realized, standing in her kitchen with her arms crossed over her chest and her breath a little unsteady, that she was angry. She was angry in a way that felt disproportionate to the situation and that she did not entirely understand. A man was fixing her fence. A man was spending his own time and materials on a property that was not his own, and asking nothing in return, and she was angry about it. And the reason she was angry, if she was honest with herself in the particular brutal way the plains forced honesty upon you when you were alone enough for long enough, was that she could not figure out what he wanted. Because everyone wanted something. Clarence had wanted a domestic arrangement that cost him as little emotional currency as possible. The women in town who occasionally visited wanted gossip, and the satisfaction of seeing that the notorious widow Talmadge was managing, but not managing too well. Purvis Eckhart at the general store wanted the business of her account. Even Obie wanted the security of a place to be old and useful. Everybody wanted something. Marshall Haskins had said he wanted nothing, and Bessie could not make that calculation balance. She went to see Dorothy Faraday, who ran the millinery in town, and was the closest thing to a friend Bessie had allowed herself since arriving in Cutter's Fork. Dorothy was a compact, sharp-eyed woman of 35 who had buried one husband and declined to acquire another, which gave her and Bessie a certain commonality of experience without requiring either of them to discuss it. Bessie described the situation with careful neutrality. Dorothy Faraday looked at her with the expression of a woman who saw through careful neutrality the way she saw through cheap silk, which was to say immediately and completely. Dorothy said, "Marshall Haskins. Of course it is Marshall Haskins." Bessie said, "You know him," Dorothy said. "Everybody knows him, Bessie. Or rather, everybody knows of him. He has been working for the Garrity family for 3 years. Before that he was down near San Antonio, from what I understand. He does not come into town much. He is quiet. He does not drink at the saloon. He does not cause trouble." Bessie said, "Why would a man spend his Saturday fixing a widow's fence without asking for anything?" Dorothy looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite amusement and not quite sympathy, but something balanced between the two. Dorothy said, "Perhaps he is simply a good man, Bessie." Bessie said, "Nobody is simply a good man." Dorothy said, "That is a very bleak philosophy." Bessie said, That is 2 years of marriage and 28 years of living." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What I know of Marshall Haskins is that he had a wife. About 4 years ago, down near San Antonio. She died. A fever, I heard, though the details are not things anyone speaks of directly. He has been working land and keeping to himself since." Bessie sat with this information. She said, "A man who has lost someone," Dorothy said, "like someone else I know." Bessie said, "It is not the same." Dorothy said, "No, it never is exactly, but grief makes us recognize grief sometimes, even when we are not fully ready to." Bessie drove home in her wagon through the flat afternoon, and she thought about what Dorothy had said, and she thought about what she herself had said, and she thought about the perfectly level gate post standing at the entrance to her property, straight and solid and true. In December, he came back. It had been a cold November, and the freeze had cracked 2 of the boards in the corral fence nearest the road. Bessie had known about them for 2 weeks and had been planning to ask Obie to look at them, though Obie's eyes and his hands were not what they once were, and she worried about him on a ladder in the cold. Marshall Haskins arrived on the first Saturday of December with fresh-cut cedar boards in his wagon and replaced the cracked sections without being asked. This time, Bessie put on her coat and walked out to the fence. She stood 6 feet away from him with her arms at her sides and watched him work. He did not react to her presence. He did not stop working or speak to her or make any gesture that acknowledged she was there in a way that felt either welcoming or intimidating. He simply continued working, fitting the new boards into the frame with careful attention. After several minutes, Bessie said, "Your wife, her name was Clara." His hands paused for just a fraction of a second. Then they continued. He said, "Eleanor." He said it simply, "Eleanor," like the word was still precious even though it was painful. Bessie said, "I am sorry." He said, "Thank you." There was a silence in which the cold wind came across the flat land and pushed through them both. He said, "Her name was Eleanor Haskins. She was 27 years old. She grew yellow roses in the yard because she said the yellow ones were the bravest. The fever took her in 6 days, and I spent the first year after thinking I would never again feel the ordinary weight of a day." He said it without self-pity. He said it the way a man recounts a true thing because it is true, and he has made a kind of peace with it that does not require it to be softened. Bessie said, "My husband was not a man I loved the way a wife should love a husband. I have carried the guilt of that for 2 years." She did not know why she said it. She had not said it to Dorothy. She had not said it to anyone. It had lived in her like a splinter working its way deeper, and it came out now in the cold December air beside a corral fence because Marshall Haskins had said Eleanor without flinching, and something about that honesty had unlocked her own. He turned then and looked at her, not with pity, not with judgment, just with the direct, weathered attention of someone truly listening. He said, "Grief does not require love to be real. Sometimes it is the grief of what was never had that takes the longest to move through." She looked at him. He looked at her. Then he turned back to the fence. She went inside. She stood in her kitchen and pressed both hands flat against the wooden table and took several long breaths while her heart did something irregular and unasked for inside her chest. She told herself it was the cold air. January was brutal. The kind of January that the plains delivered without apology, where the wind came down from the north with nothing to stop it for 1,000 miles, and the temperature dropped to places that made even the cattle look personally offended. Obie came down with a chest cold that kept him in his bunk in the barn for 2 weeks, and Bessie managed the morning feeding and the checking of the water troughs alone, breaking ice before dawn with a sledgehammer while her breath made clouds in the dark air. She was at the water trough behind the barn on the first Saturday of January when she heard the wagon. She heard it stop at the road. She heard the sound of him working for a while, and then silence, and then the sound of boots crunching through frost-stiffened grass coming toward the barn. She straightened up with the sledgehammer in her hands and turned around. Marshall Haskins stopped at a respectful distance when he saw she was there. He was wearing a sheepskin-lined coat and a wool muffler around his throat, and his breath came out in visible puffs in the freezing air. He was carrying a coil of new rope. He said, "The rope on your front gate latch is frayed through. Another week of cold and it will snap. I brought a replacement. The corral on the east side has a rail that is bowing. I noticed it last month. I can brace it from the inside if you will allow me to work in there," she said. "It is below freezing." He said, "Yes, ma'am," she said. "Obi is sick. He cannot help." He said, "I did not come to impose on Obi." She looked at him standing there in the January cold with coiled rope and a manner of absolute patient steadiness, and she felt the anger she had been using as insulation begin to develop cracks of its own. She said, "I have coffee on the stove. I will bring you a cup when you have finished." The look that crossed his face then was so carefully controlled that she might have missed it if she had not been watching him as closely as she had been watching him, which was more closely than she wanted to admit. It was not triumph, it was something quieter, something that looked almost like gratitude. He said, "That would be very kind. Thank you, Mrs. Talmadge." She brought him coffee on the porch steps when he was done, setting the tin cup down on the step and stepping back to what she had calculated was a non-inviting distance. He sat on the bottom step and drank the coffee and looked out at the flat land whitened by frost, and they did not talk much, but the silence was different than the silences before it. It had a texture to it, an accommodation. He left when the coffee was gone. She watched from the window again. She thought about Alina, who grew yellow roses because yellow ones were the bravest. In February, he replaced the rotted step on the porch that Bessie had been putting boards across as a workaround since November. She brought him coffee again. This time he stayed long enough to tell her about the Garrity spread, how he managed the horses mostly, 32 of them, and the work it involved. He described a particular mare that had foaled in December, a difficult birth that had required him to stay up through 2 nights. He described the foal with a kind of quiet delight that sat oddly and wonderfully on a man his size. Bessie found herself telling him about the broker in Abilene and the difficulty of negotiating cattle prices as a woman alone, the particular way certain men spoke to her in those negotiations, as though the very fact of her gender was an argument she had not accounted for. She said it with a dry, wry edge that she did not often allow herself in public. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that starts somewhere deep and comes out without being edited. She had not expected it to be such a good sound. She thought about it for the rest of February. March brought him back with new hinges for the barn door, which had been hanging crooked since a windstorm in January. He also brought a package of grass seed, which she had not asked for and which was, she realized as she turned it over in her hands, exactly the variety suited to the depleted stretch of pasture along the south fence line that she had been worrying about. "Ed, how did you know this pasture needed overseeding?" he said. "I can see the color from the road when I pass. The soil there has given out what it had," she said. "You look at my land when you pass." He met her eyes and did not look away when he said, "I do." It was not a declaration. He was not performing anything. He was simply stating a truth with the same plainness with which he stated all his truths, and the plainness was somehow more affecting than any elaborate expression would have been. She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "Come and have coffee," and she walked into the house and left the door open behind her, and after a moment she heard his boots on the repaired porch step. He did not come inside. He stopped at the doorway, in that zone between outside and in, and leaned against the frame while she poured the coffee. They talked for an hour. About the grass and the seasons and the peculiarities of the Llano Estacado, which had a way of being beautiful and merciless in the same breath. About a family of roadrunners that had taken up residence along her south fence line, and that she had begun watching in the mornings with a fondness that surprised her. About the recent election in Cutter's Fork that had installed a new sheriff named Aldous Price, who was reputed to be either very effective or very corrupt depending on whom you asked. He stood in the doorway and she stood in the kitchen, and the distance between them felt both appropriate and insufficient. When he left, Bessie stood in the middle of her kitchen and said aloud to no one, "You are being foolish, Bessie Talmadge." But she was smiling when she said it, and smiling was something she had been doing more of in the last 5 months than in the 2 years before them combined, and she could not entirely make herself feel bad about that. April was green and warm, and Marshall Haskins arrived on the first Saturday with new planks for the chicken coop, which was overdue, and spent the afternoon expanding it and reinforcing the wire on the sides where Bessie had been finding signs of something trying to dig under. Obie was up and moving again, recovered from his winter illness, and he sat on a hay bale in the yard and watched Marshall work with the frank appraisal of an old man who has seen enough to know quality when he encounters it. Obie said to Bessie afterward in his direct and unconcerned way, "That man has got proper intentions toward you." Bessie said, Obie said, "I am telling you what I see. A man does not come to a woman's place every month for half a year and fix things for the sake of the fence posts." Bessie said, "He is kind, he is doing good works." Obie said, "He is doing good works for one woman specifically, and he is doing them careful and patient and without pushing, which means either he is a saint or he is a man who knows what he wants and is willing to wait for the right time to say so." Bessie said nothing. Obie said, "He is not a saint, Bessie. I am of that age where I can tell." That evening she sat on the repaired porch step in the last of the April light and looked at the gate post that had started all of this, standing plumb and solid at the boundary of her land, and she thought about what it meant that a man came back month after month without demanding anything. She thought about what it said about patience, about respect, about the particular kind of caring that did not announce itself but simply showed up with tools and worked. She thought about how Clarence had never once repaired anything without being asked 3 times and making her feel the weight of the asking. She thought about Eleanor and yellow roses. She went inside and wrote a letter to her sister in Missouri, the first personal letter she had written in 2 years. She wrote that she was well. She wrote that the land was good. She wrote that there was something interesting happening that she was not yet ready to name. In May, he came back and repaired the water pump behind the house that had been throwing rust and losing pressure. It was a complicated job, requiring parts he had sourced from the hardware store in town, and it took him most of the day. Bessie brought him lunch. She set a plate on the porch railing, bread and salt pork and cold biscuits left from breakfast, and a jar of the apple butter she had put up in the fall. He stopped working when he saw it, and he looked at the plate, and then he looked at her, and something moved through his face that he did not quite conceal in time. He said, "You did not need to do that," she said. "You have been working since 8 in the morning and it is past noon. Eat." He sat on the porch steps and ate, and she sat in the rocking chair she had dragged from the parlor onto the porch, and they talked through lunch in a way that had settled into an ease that neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would have required acknowledging what it was. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, a farm outside Jefferson City, a father who was a hard man in the way certain prairie men were hard, shaped by shortage and disappointment into something that passed for toughness, but was actually brittleness. He told her about leaving at 17 with enough money for a train ticket and the specific desperate freedom of that departure. He told her about the years between Jefferson City and San Antonio, working ranches across Oklahoma and East Texas, learning horses and cattle and the particular language of the land. She told him about her own Missouri childhood, which had been kinder in some ways and narrower in others. A father who read to her, which was rare, and a mother who had died when Bessie was 12, and the specific quality of growing up responsible in a house where there was no one else to be responsible. She told him about meeting Clarence Talmadge at 25, and the reasonable hopes she had carried into that marriage, and the slow way those hopes had been ground down not by cruelty, but by indifference, which she was beginning to understand was its own kind of cruelty. He listened the way she had not been listened to in years, fully, without waiting for his turn to speak, without redirecting the conversation toward himself. He listened and he was present, and it was one of the most intimate experiences Bessie had had in her adult life, and they were on a porch and fully clothed in bright daylight. When he stood to go back to the water pump, he paused on the step and looked at her with those dark, careful eyes. He said, "Mrs. Talmadge, thank you for the lunch." She said, "It is Bessie." He stood very still for a moment. He said, "Thank you, Bessie." After he was gone, she sat in the rocking chair for a long time in the May afternoon, and felt the warmth of her own name said by his voice settle somewhere in her chest like a coal that had been properly lit. She was in very serious trouble, and she knew it. June brought him with fresh whitewash for the fence rails that had been weathering gray, and he spent the day working down the length of the fence line while the summer heat built toward noon. Bessie worked in her garden, which was close enough to the fence that they could speak without raising their voices, and they talked in the comfortable, interrupted way of people engaged in separate but proximate work. A few sentences here, a pause, a few sentences more. She asked him about his plans for the future. She asked it carefully, without attaching any weight to the question that she was not prepared to acknowledge. He straightened from the fence rail he was painting and looked down the long line of white ahead of him. He said, "I have been putting money away. 3 years at Garrity's wages, careful living. I have enough to stake a claim on land of my own. I have been looking at a parcel about 8 miles from here. Good soil, a creek that runs year-round." She said, "You want your own place." He said, "A man ought to have something of his own, something he has built." He paused and then he said, "A home." She kept her eyes on the tomato plants she was staking. She said, "That is a good ambition." He said, "I think so." There was a silence in which the word home sat between them in the June air and meant several things at once without either of them reaching for it. That evening, she found Dorothy Faraday at the millinery and told her what Marshall had said about the land. Dorothy looked at her with the expression of someone watching a scene she has been following for a while now, and finding it both gratifying and slightly maddening. Dorothy said, "Bessie Talmadge, are you waiting for that man to make some kind of formal declaration on a fence post?" Bessie said, "I am not waiting for anything." Dorothy said, "You absolutely are. You are both waiting, and you are both being enormously careful, and it is very admirable and also quite exhausting to watch." Bessie said, "He has not said anything directly." Dorothy said, "Has he not? He comes to your property every month. He feeds the horse of a woman who will not even properly invite him inside. He asked about your cattle negotiation situation, and then he told me about it when I saw him in Eckhart's store, Bessie. He spoke to me about your business concern because he wanted to know if there was something he could do that would help." Bessie stopped. She said, "He spoke to you about me?" Dorothy said, "He asked, very carefully and without any impropriety, whether you had a working relationship with anyone who advocated for you with the brokers in Abilene. He was not prying. He was concerned." Bessie drove home that night under a sky full of June stars and thought about a man who was concerned about her cattle prices and repaired her water pump and said the word home the way he said it, which was like something he had imagined for long enough that it had become specific. She thought about Eleanor's yellow roses. She thought about what it would mean to plant something yellow. July was hot and difficult. The region around Cutter's Fork went 3 weeks without rain in the middle of the month, and the pasture grass came under pressure, and the water table dropped, and Bessie worked dawn to dusk managing the herd and worrying about the south pasture that she had overseeded in March with the grass seed Marshall had brought. He came on the first Saturday of July and found her mending a section of fence along the back pasture in the direct heat of the afternoon, and he did not ask permission. He simply put on his work gloves and took the section of fence wire she was wrestling with and held it taut while she fastened it. They worked together for 2 hours without speaking much, moving down the fence line in a kind of wordless coordination that felt, to Bessie, almost shocking in its naturalness. She had worked this land alone for over a year. She had made herself understand alone as her fundamental condition. And here was a man who moved beside her in the heat of a July afternoon, as though the space next to her was exactly where he was supposed to be, adjusting to her pace, handing her tools before she had to ask for them, reading her intentions the way you read the intentions of someone you have been paying close attention to. When they were done, they sat in the shade of the water tank and drank from their respective canteens, and the heat pressed down on everything with the democratic brutality of a Texas July. She said, "Did you put in the offer on the land? The 8 miles north," he said. "I did. I am waiting to hear from the land office. Should know by the end of the month." She said, "What will you do with it?" He said, "Build. Cattle, I think, and horses. I know horses." She said, "You would give up working for the Garrities." He said, "I have given them good years. They will find another man." She looked at him sideways in the shade. She said, "You are really going to do it?" He said, "I am." She said, "I am glad for you." He turned and looked at her directly and said, "Are you?" The question was simple, and it was not simple at all. It carried the weight of everything that had been accumulating between them for 9 months, quiet and patient and unsaid, and the heat made everything more direct than it might otherwise have been. She said, "Yes, I think you deserve a place that is yours." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he said, "I think you deserve a great many things too, Bessie Talmadge. I think you deserve more than you have allowed yourself to accept." She looked away first. She said, "That is a complicated thing to say." He said, "It is a straightforward thing to mean." She drove home that evening with her heart doing that irregular thing it had been doing with increasing frequency, and she sat on the repaired porch step in the long summer dusk and let herself, for the first time, fully think about Marshall Haskins the way she had been carefully not thinking about him for 9 months. She thought about what it would mean to trust someone again, what it would cost, what it might possibly be worth. She thought about the gate post standing straight at the boundary of her land. She thought about the whitewashed fence and the repaired porch step, and the water pump that ran clean and strong, and the chicken coop that had kept every last bird safe through 3 months of predator season. She thought about a man who came back every month without being asked, without bargaining, without any apparent agenda beyond the doing of useful things for a woman who had given him very little encouragement and a great deal of closed doors. What did it mean? She thought she knew. She thought she had known for a while, and the knowing frightened her in a way that she was beginning to understand, had nothing to do with him specifically, and everything to do with the particular scar that Clarence Talmadge had left on her capacity to believe that the ordinary arrangements of life between a man and a woman could ever be anything other than the slow erosion of one person's hope against another person's indifference. But Marshall Haskins was not Clarence Talmadge. That was the thing she kept bumping up against. He was so entirely and categorically not Clarence Talmadge that trying to apply the lessons of one to the other was like using a map of Missouri to navigate Texas. The terrain simply did not correspond. August was better for rain. The south pasture recovered. The cattle gained weight. Bessie negotiated a good price through the Abilene broker for a second batch of steers, and felt the specific satisfaction of a woman who has mastered a skill through sheer determined repetition. She told Marshall about it when he came on the first Saturday of August, this time to patch the section of roof over the small lean-to at the back of the barn that had been letting in water. She told him about the negotiation with a certain amount of restrained pride, and he looked down from the barn roof where he was working and listened, and when she was done he said, "You got fair value," she said, "better than fair. I held out when he tried to move the price down and he came up." He said, "Good. A man who tries to discount your cattle because you are a woman alone is not a man who deserves your business. You were right to hold." She said, "I nearly did not. I nearly took the first offer because I was afraid of losing the deal entirely." He said, "But you did not," she said, "but I did not." He looked at her from the barn roof with the sun behind him, and he said, "You are a great deal braver than you give yourself credit for, Bessie." She felt the warmth of that move through her in a way that was not about flattery. It was about being seen accurately by someone whose accuracy she had come to trust. September came, and with it, a new development. A man named Harlan Creed arrived in Cutter's Fork on the stage from Abilene. He was 35 years old, well dressed by the standards of the region, and he had what could only be described as a prospecting eye for women of independent means. He had heard somewhere, perhaps from the broker in Abilene, that the widow Talmadge had 160 acres of good land with an adequate water source, and was managing it successfully alone. He introduced himself to Bessie at Eckhart's General Store on a Wednesday morning, with a level of practiced charm that Bessie recognized immediately as the performance of a man who had deployed it many times before. She was polite. She was not interested. She told him she was busy with the fall preparations and excused herself. He was not discouraged. He appeared at her gate on a Thursday with flowers from some corner of his luggage, a bunch of dried roses that had clearly been purchased at a previous destination, and the look of a man who expected a favorable reception. Bessie stood on her porch with her arms crossed and said, "Mr. Creed, I did not invite you here," he said, with an easy smile that she found immediately unpleasant. "A man can call on a widow woman without a formal invitation, Mrs. Talmadge. I am only being neighborly." She said, "You arrived in this town 4 days ago. You are not my neighbor, and I am not in the market for a caller," he said. "A woman alone has practical considerations. I am a man of some resources, and I admire what you have done here. We could discuss a partnership arrangement that would benefit us both," she said. "You mean marriage," he said. "I mean a practical arrangement," she said. "I have made very clear in this conversation that I am not interested. Please do not come back to this property." He left, but he did not look like a man who had heard the word no as final, and that bothered her. She mentioned it to Dorothy the next day, and Dorothy said, with more feeling than Bessie expected, "I know men like Harlan Creed. They want the land. You are an appendage to the land in his calculation. Be careful." She mentioned it to Obie, who said in his direct way, "That man has got a hungry look about him, not a good hunger." She did not mention it to Marshall Haskins when he came on the first Saturday of September. She did not mention it because she did not want him to think she was asking him for anything. She had not asked him for anything in 12 months. The work he did was his to offer or not offer, and she was not going to introduce Harlan Creed into the equation as a way of drawing something from Marshall that she was not sure she was ready to receive. Marshall came, and he looked at the gate post that had been the first thing he ever fixed, and he found the crack that had been developing in the cedar for 2 months, the long diagonal split that was working its way from the top of the post down toward the base. He said, "This post needs replacing again. The wood was always going to have this problem. The grain runs wrong for a post this size in this climate. I should have sourced better material at the start." Bessie stood at the gate and looked at the split, and she was acutely aware of how much time they had now been standing in variations of this position, on either side of a boundary, one inside and one outside, and the metaphor of it was not lost on her. She said, "How much time do we have before it falls?" He said, "Not long. A good wind, another hard rain, it will go." She said, "Fix it." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He went to the wagon for tools and materials, and Bessie stood at the gate watching him go, and she was thinking about all the things she had not said in 12 months of mornings and afternoons, and the slow building of something she had refused to name. She was thinking about Dorothy's question about formal declarations on fence posts. She was thinking about what it meant that this man, this quiet, patient, careful man with dark eyes and good hands and a dead wife he still loved enough to say the name of with tenderness, kept coming back. And then she saw Harlan Creed. He was coming up the road from town on a tall bay horse, dressed for calling, and he had not seen her yet or had chosen not to appear as though he had. He was riding with the easy entitlement of a man who had decided that his persistence was a virtue. She felt something cold move through her, not fear, closer to revulsion. Marshall came back to the gate with his tools and saw Harlan Creed coming up the road. He looked at Creed, and then he looked at Bessie with a question in his face that was entirely silent and entirely clear. She said quietly, "He has been coming here. I told him to stop." Marshall said nothing. He set his tools down beside the gate post and watched Creed ride up and slow to a stop. Creed looked at Marshall with the assessing expression of a man recalculating. he said, "Mrs. Talmadge." "I was hoping to speak with you," Bessie said. "I asked you not to come back, Mr. Creed. I meant it." Creed said with a glance at Marshall, "Is this man bothering you? I can have a word with him if you need." Bessie said, and there was iron in it that even the wind seemed to straighten for, "This man is here at my request doing work on my property. You are here against my explicit wishes. If either of you is a problem for me in this moment, it is you." Creed's smile tightened. He said, "Mrs. Talmadge, I am only trying to," she said. "I know what you are trying to do. You are trying to acquire 160 acres of land at the price of a flattering conversation and a bunch of dead flowers." "I am not for sale, Mr. Creed, and neither is my land. Now ride back to town and do not come here again." There was a silence. Creed looked from Bessie to Marshall, who had not moved and had not spoken, and was looking at Creed with the quiet, unemphatic steadiness of a man who did not need to raise his voice to convey a position. Creed said, "You will reconsider." Marshall spoke then, quietly. He said, "I think she was clear." Creed looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned the bay horse and rode back down the road without another word. Bessie let out a breath she had been holding. Marshall returned to the gate post and began his work. After a moment Bessie said, "Thank you," he said. "You handled it yourself." "I did not do anything," she said. "You were there." He said, "Yes." She stood at the gate for a moment longer, and she thought about that. The simple, enormous fact of someone being there, not intervening, not overriding, not rescuing her from a situation she was perfectly capable of handling, simply being present, steady, available. She went back inside. And then it was the first Saturday of October again, which made it exactly 1 year, 12 months, 12 visits, 12 slow increments of trust being built with hand tools and cedar wood and good conversation, and the kind of patience that Bessie was beginning to understand was its own form of love. She had been thinking about it all of September. She had been thinking about it in the mornings when she walked past the gate post that was holding but only just, and in the evenings when she sat on the repaired porch step and watched the first stars appear over the flat land, and in the long October nights that were beginning to cool toward winter again. She had been thinking about what she was afraid of. She had been thinking about whether the fear was a warning or a habit. She had been thinking about a leaner and yellow roses. She had been thinking about what it meant that a dead woman had taught her something about bravery, without either of them ever being in the same place. She had been thinking about what Dorothy had said about simply good men, and what Obie had said about proper intentions, and what Marshall himself had said in July about deserving more than she had allowed herself to accept. She had been thinking about a home. And so when she heard the wagon on the first Saturday of October 1882, and she came to the window and watched Marshall Haskins climb down and walk to the gate post that had split down the middle and was clearly beyond saving, and she watched him run his hands along the wood and shake his head slightly, and she watched him walk back to the wagon for tools and materials, she had already made her decision. She put on her good dress. Not her best dress, which lived in a trunk and came out only for church, but her second best dress, the blue one that she had bought in Abilene 2 years ago and had worn 6 times because she never had an occasion worthy of it. She smoothed it and put on her good boots and looked at herself in the small mirror by the washstand for a moment. She looked like a woman who had decided something. She went out onto the porch. He was at the wagon, gathering his tools. He had not seen her yet. She opened her mouth. She said, "Mr. Haskins." He turned. She said, "Would you come inside?" And the story arrived at the moment where it had begun, and Marshall Haskins stood with one boot on the fence rail and looked at her with those dark, careful eyes, and the wind moved through the tall grass, and the crow lifted and sailed south, and the wagon horse blew a long breath through its nose. He said, "Yes, ma'am, I believe I would." He walked up the path to the house. She had noticed in 12 months that he always walked the path. Never cut across the grass the way certain kinds of men would, the ones who treated someone else's land as a thoroughfare. He walked the path she had made, following the line she had established, respecting the shape of her world. He stopped at the porch steps, and she stood aside, and he came up the steps and across the porch and through the door she held open, and he stepped inside the house for the very first time. He stood in the kitchen and looked around with the careful, undemonstrative appreciation of a man taking in something significant. The kitchen was neat and practical, with the accumulated small signs of a person who lived fully in their space, a row of preserves on the shelf, a braided rug by the stove that Obi had made her 2 winters ago, a small window with white muslin curtains that Bessie had put up because she wanted one room in the house that was entirely her own choice. He turned and looked at her. She was standing by the stove with her hands folded in front of her and her heart doing the loudest, most impolite thing it had done in years. She said, "Sit down, Mr. Haskins." He pulled out the chair at the kitchen table with the careful consideration of a man who understood he was in someone else's space and that this was an honor rather than a right. He sat. She poured coffee. She set a plate of biscuits on the table, the ones she had made that morning with deliberate hands. She poured her own cup and sat down across from him. She said, "You have been coming here for 1 year." He said, "Yes." She said, "You have repaired my gate post, my fence, my corral, my porch step, my water pump, my barn roof, my chicken coop. You have brought grass seed and new rope and whitewash and lumber. You have asked for nothing." He said, "I asked for nothing because I had nothing to ask that would have been appropriate to ask." She said, "And now?" He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands and looked at it, and then he looked at her with the full, unguarded attention he had always given her when he was saying something true. He said, "Now you have asked me inside, and I find that I want to be very careful about what I do with that." She said, "Meaning?" He said, "Meaning that I think you know, and I think I know, that this has not been about fence posts for a very long time. And I want to say something true to you, and I want you to hear it without thinking it is a demand or a manipulation or a play for anything other than what it is." She said, "Say it." He said, "Bessie Talmadge, I have been coming to this property every month for a year because this is where you are. Not because the fence needed mending, though the fence did need mending. Not because I had nothing better to do with a Saturday, though some months that was also true. Because this is where you are, and I found, somewhere in the first or second or third month, that I could not make a good argument to myself for being anywhere else." She sat with that. The kitchen was quiet around them. The stove ticked gently. The October light came through the muslin curtains in a softened, golden way. She said, "I am not an easy woman. I was married to a man who found me difficult and eventually simply stopped trying. And I am not certain whether that was his failing or mine or some proportion of each." He said, "I am not looking for easy. I spent the first year after Alina died telling myself I would not survive it, and I did survive it, and surviving it taught me that what I want in my life is something real, not uncomplicated. Real," she said. "I am afraid." He said, "I know, I can see it. I have seen it every month for a year, the way you stand back just at the edge of something and will not come the last step forward. I am not asking you to come further than you can come, Bessie. I am just asking you to tell me what you need." Something cracked open in Bessie Talmadge's chest, not the way things crack when they break, the way they crack when they have been frozen for a long time and the thaw finally comes. She said, "I need to know that you will still be here in a year. In 5 years, I need to know that you will not look through me, that you will not stop seeing me." He said, "I can promise you that. I can promise you that, not because I am a perfect man who will never cause you a moment of difficulty, because I am not that and I would be lying to you if I claimed otherwise. But I can promise you that I have never in this year of knowing you looked at anything other than you when you were in my sight. And I do not believe I am built for the kind of forgetting you are describing." She looked at him across the kitchen table. She said, "I planted yellow roses last spring, along the east fence. I do not know why I am telling you that." He looked at her and something moved through his face that was profound and complex, and she thought, answered a question he might not have known he was still asking. He said very quietly, "Thank you." She nodded. She said, "Finish your coffee, Mr. Haskins, and then go fix that gate post because someone has to." He smiled. It was the second time she had seen his real smile, the full one without reserve, and it was still as good as the first time. He said, "Yes, ma'am." He fixed the gate post. He used ash this time rather than cedar, better grain for the climate and the soil conditions at the base. He was meticulous about the setting, taking even more time than usual with the leveling, as though he understood that this particular post had a significance beyond the structural. When he was done, he came to the porch and Bessie was already in the rocking chair she had not put back in the parlor, and she gestured to the chair on the other side of the porch that she had brought out that morning without fully acknowledging to herself why. He sat in the chair. They sat on the porch together in the October afternoon and they talked, and this time there was no wall between them. Not the literal wall of the house with her inside and him at the threshold, and not the other walls either, the ones made of fear and caution and the accumulated damage of a life lived more carefully than it needed to be. He told her about the land he had purchased, 7 miles north rather than 8, because the terms had been better, and the creek ran through the southern portion of the property, which was the more useful placement. He had begun clearing and would start building in the spring. A small house first with good bones, built to be expanded. She said, "Built to be expanded." He said, "I am an optimistic man about certain things." She said, "What things?" He said, "Yellow roses. Well-set fence posts. Good coffee in the afternoon. The particular quality of a Texas October when it decides to be generous." She said, "Those are specific optimisms." He said, "I am a specific kind of optimist." She looked at him in the afternoon light with the flat land behind him stretching to the edge of the sky, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular sensation of a future being possible. Not the abstract, managed future she had been navigating for 2 years, the one defined by necessity and practicality and the careful suppression of wanting, but a future that had a warmth to it, a future that held something beyond the adequate. November came, and Marshall did not need to come to fix anything that month because everything was in good order. He came anyway. He drove up on the first Saturday of November and knocked on the door of the house in a way that was entirely different from the way he had knocked on nothing for a year, because he had never knocked before. He had simply appeared and worked and left. Bessie opened the door. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and said, "I was wondering if you might like to come and see the land. My land. I have started clearing the south field and I would value your opinion on the placement of the house." She looked at him. She said, "You want my opinion on the placement of your house?" He said, "I do. You have managed this land alone for over a year and you know things about soil and drainage and the way the wind moves across the Llano that I would be a fool not to take advantage of." She said, "That is a very practical reason for an invitation." He said, with a completely straight face, "I am a practical man." She put on her coat and her boots and climbed up on the wagon seat beside him, and they drove north through the November air, and it was the first time she had been in a wagon beside a man she was not obligated to be there for, the first time she had chosen proximity rather than accepted it, and the difference was enormous. His land was good. She could see that immediately. The creek he had described ran clear and strong along the southern edge, and the soil in the cleared field had a dark, loamy quality that told her it would hold water well and drain in the right season. The grass where it had not been cleared was the good native variety that she recognized from the best sections of her own property. He showed her where he had staked out the location of the house, set back from the creek on a gentle rise that would protect the foundation from the spring floods but give it a clear view south. She walked the staked perimeter. She said, "The kitchen should face east. Morning light in the kitchen is important. And you want the main window looking toward the creek because the willows along the bank will be worth seeing in every season." He said, "East-facing kitchen, main window on the creek side." She said, "You are writing this down in your head." He said, "I am." She stood on the gentle rise with the November wind moving her hair and the creek visible below and the whole beautiful flat enormity of the land in every direction. And she thought about the word home the way he had said it in June, specific and warm and full of intention. She said, "You will need a kitchen garden along the south wall, protected from the north wind by the house itself. Herbs and vegetables will do well there." He said, "What would you plant?" She said, "Tomatoes, beans, onions, rosemary." She paused. "Roses along the east fence." He said, "Yellow ones." She looked at him. He was looking at her with those dark eyes that gave back light in a way she had spent a year learning to read, and she thought that what they were saying now was everything that had not been said yet and was about to be. She said, "Marshall." He said, "Bessie." She said, "I am going to be difficult sometimes. I am going to pull back when I am afraid, and I am going to be slow to ask for help, and I am going to need you to be patient in the way you have been patient this year, not all the time, but sometimes." He said, "I know. And I am going to be too quiet sometimes, and sometimes I will work through a feeling rather than speak it, and I will occasionally spend too long on a fence post when what you actually need is for me to sit on the porch." She said, "That is an accurate and self-aware statement." He said, "I have had a year to think about it." She said, "So have I." The wind moved between them and around them, and the creek said its quiet thing below, and the sky went on forever in every direction. He took a step toward her and stopped and said, "May I?" She said, "Yes." He took her hand, both hands. He held them in his, and his hands were warm from work and big and careful, the hands of a man who understood the weight and fragility of things, and Bessie felt the warmth of them travel up her arms and through her chest and into the place where the frozen thing had been for so long. He said, "I would very much like to court you, Bessie Talmadge, properly and honestly, with the intent that I think we both already understand." She said, "You have been courting me for a year." He said, "I have been hoping for a year. There is a difference." She said, "Not as much as you think." He squeezed her hands gently and let her go, and they stood on the gentle rise above the creek in November and looked at the staked boundaries of a house that was going to be built, and Bessie felt something in herself begin to move toward it. December came, and with it the proper courtship that Marshall had proposed, which in practical terms meant that he drove to the Talmadge homestead on Saturday afternoons and spent them in Bessie's kitchen or on Bessie's porch, or, as December deepened into genuine cold, in Bessie's parlor where she had a fire going, and where they sat across from each other in the good chairs and talked for hours about everything, and nothing with the specific pleasure of people who have found someone worth talking to. He brought her books. He had found, during his years of working ranches, a habit of reading that was unusual among the men he worked with, and that he had never been entirely sure what to do with socially. He discovered that Bessie read too, that she had brought a small collection of books from Missouri and supplemented them whenever the traveling book merchant came through Cutter's Fork, and that she had opinions about what she read that were forthright and often unexpected. They argued pleasantly about a Charles Dickens novel for 45 minutes one December evening, Bessie maintaining that a certain character was redeemable and Marshall maintaining, with equal firmness, that the evidence did not support this reading. And it was the most enjoyable argument Bessie had had in years, an argument where the other person was genuinely engaging with her ideas rather than waiting for her to stop talking. She caught herself laughing in a way she had not laughed in so long that the sound surprised her. Not a polite laugh, not the managed social laugh she deployed at church and at Dorothy's millinery. A real one, unguarded, coming from somewhere genuine. He looked at her when she laughed like that with an expression of such undisguised warmth that she had to look at her book. She told Dorothy about the argument. Dorothy said, "He is very much in love with you." Bessie said, "Dorothy." Dorothy said, "Do not Dorothy me with that voice. He is completely in love with you. It is very obvious to everyone who has seen you together for 30 consecutive seconds." Bessie said, "We have not said." Dorothy said, "Some things do not require saying to be absolutely, unmistakably present." Bessie thought about that on the drive home through the December dark. She thought about it for the whole of December. On Christmas Day, Marshall came in the afternoon. Obie had joined them for the midday meal, which Bessie had cooked for three, and the four of them had spent a surprisingly cheerful Christmas together, Obie regaling Marshall with stories from his earlier life that Bessie had mostly heard before, but that Marshall listened to with the attentiveness he gave to all things said in his presence. When the evening came and Obie had retired to the barn and the cold pressed close against the house, Marshall and Bessie sat by the parlor fire, and he reached into his coat and brought out a small package wrapped in brown paper. He said, "I made this." She unwrapped it. It was a small carved wooden box, cedar, made with the same careful precision he brought to all his work. The lid was carved with a pattern of small flowers along the border, simple and fine. On the top of the lid were the letters BT, carved with a delicacy that the large, capable hands holding it did not suggest, but that did not surprise her at all. She held it in both hands and looked at it. She said, "Marshall." He said, "I know it is not much." She said, "Do not say that. It is beautiful." She looked up at him, and the firelight was between them, and she thought about 12 months of fence posts and coffee cups and conversations, and the slow, patient building of something that was now here, solid and real in her hands as surely as the cedar box. She said, "I love you." She said it because it was true, and she had learned in this last year that true things did not improve with keeping. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone hearing a thing they had hoped for long enough that hearing it felt almost unreal. He said, "I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd month. When you came out in the December cold and told me about your husband in the same breath as letting me tell you about a leaner, because you thought I needed someone to meet me in that, and you were right." She said, "That was not bravery, that was an impulse." He said, "The best things usually are." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and the fire said its comfortable thing and the wind said its cold thing against the shutters, and inside the house it was warm. January came again, another January, and Marshall had left the garret he spread at the end of December. He was living temporarily at a room in town while he began the construction of the house on his land. He came to the Talmadge homestead not just on Saturdays now, but several times a week, for meals, for the comfortable company of the parlor fire, for the sustained pleasure of being near a person who had become the person he most wanted to be near. He was also working every dry day on the house, and Bessie drove out to the land on 2 of those days to see the progress, and found herself looking at the frame going up on the gentle rise above the creek, with a feeling she could not quite categorize. A mixture of happiness for him and something else, something that had to do with the east-facing kitchen, and the window looking toward the willows and the yellow roses she had suggested along the fence. He had staked out a kitchen garden along the south wall exactly as she had described it. In February, he proposed. He did it on her porch in the afternoon, with no particular ceremony and no dramatic staging, which was entirely consistent with who he was. He simply stopped in the middle of a sentence about the house construction and turned to look at her and said, "Bessie, I want to marry you. I want us to build this together. I want the east-facing kitchen and the roses and the books argued over by the fire and the particular quality of your laugh when something is genuinely funny. I want all of it, and I want it with you for the rest of however many years we get. Will you have me?" She looked at him on the porch of the house where she had watched him through the kitchen window for 12 months, the house she had made livable by her own stubborn and determined effort, and she thought about all the questions she had needed answered and how quietly and thoroughly he had answered them, 1 month at a time, 1 fence post at a time, 1 honest sentence at a time. She said, "Yes." He let out a breath that told her he had been more nervous than he had appeared, which she found both reassuring and endearing. He said, "I have a ring. It was a Leaner's. If you would rather I get a new one, I completely understand. I want you to," she said, "show me." He brought it out. A simple gold band with a small setting, a deep blue stone that caught the February light with quiet authority. She looked at it. She said, "A Leaner had good taste." He said, "She did." She said, "I would be honored to wear it." He put it on her finger with hands that were entirely steady except for the very last moment, when the ring settled into place and his hands held hers for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she thought that last moment was the truest part of the whole thing. They were married in March, in the Baptist church in Cutter's Fork, in a ceremony that was modest and genuine, and attended by Dorothy Faraday and Obie, and several of the Garrity family, and the sheriff, Aldous Price, who it turned out was neither very effective nor very corrupt but somewhere reliably in the middle, and a few other people from town who had watched this particular story, developing for a year with the invested attention that small towns give to the private dramas of their members. Bessie wore the blue dress, the good one, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers because it was too early in the year for roses, and she thought wildflowers suited the occasion better anyway. They said their vows in plain language in front of a minister who kept it brief because Bessie had asked him to, and when it was done, Marshall Haskins looked at Bessie Haskins with the full and uncomplicated warmth of a man who is exactly where he meant to end up, and she looked back at him the same way. Obie cried. He denied it afterward with great energy and conviction, and no one believed him at all. They moved into the house on Marshall's land in May, when it was far enough along to be habitable. The kitchen faced east. The main window looked toward the willows along the creek. The kitchen garden along the south wall was planted, tomatoes and beans and onions and rosemary. Bessie managed both properties for the first season, the Talmadge land and the new Haskins land, learning the particular demands and gifts of each. Obie moved to the new place with them because he was too old to be alone and too stubborn to say so, and Marshall built him a proper room off the barn that was warmer than anything Obie had lived in for 20 years, and Obie accepted it with the gruff gratitude of a man who knows when he is loved and chooses not to embarrass everyone by making a speech about it. They planted the yellow roses along the east fence in June. Bessie stood beside Marshall on a June afternoon with dirt on her gloves and the sun warm on her back and watched him set the last rose cutting into the prepared soil. And she thought about a leaner who had said the yellow ones were the bravest. And she thought this was true. That yellow was the color of something that pushes toward the light specifically because it needs to. And that this, among the many things she had learned in this last year and a half, felt most like wisdom. Marshall stood and turned and saw her expression, and he knew what she was thinking about because they had gotten to the place where they could read each other's thinking with a reasonable accuracy, and he put his arm around her shoulders and they stood together looking at the yellow roses in the June afternoon. He said, "She would have liked you." Bessie said, "I think I would have liked her." He said, "That does not surprise me at all." By the autumn of 1883, the Haskins place was fully established. A good herd of cattle, 42 head, and 8 horses that Marshall managed with the particular affection he had always had for horses. The kitchen garden had exceeded all expectations. The yellow roses along the east fence bloomed in June with an exuberance that made Obie, who claimed not to be sentimental about flowers, sit on the east porch more often than any other part of the property. Bessie kept the Talmadge land producing, leasing the grazing rights to a young family named Caldwell who had arrived in Cutter's Fork that spring and needed access to established pasture while they built their own operation. She negotiated the lease herself directly, with the particular confidence of a woman who had been standing her own ground for 2 years and had gotten very good at it. She and Dorothy Faraday remained friends, driving into town on Wednesdays for the standing lunch they had established, which was less about eating and more about the sustaining pleasure of honest conversation between women who did not require each other to perform equanimity they did not feel. Harlan Creed had departed Cutter's Fork in November of 1882, having determined that the opportunities he had imagined were not materializing. No one missed him. In the winter of 1883, Bessie realized she was expecting. She told Marshall on a Thursday evening by the parlor fire, and the look on his face was the kind of look that is too large and too full for a face to comfortably contain, the kind of look you see on a man who has been given something he had stopped allowing himself to hope for. He said, "Bessie," she said, "I know." He said, how are you?" She said, "I am well. I am very well. I am also terrified if you want the full picture." He said, "I am also terrified. I think we are allowed to be both." She said, "Yes, I think we are." He moved his chair close to hers and took her hand and held it, and they sat together by the fire in the house on the gentle rise above the creek, while the winter pressed close against the walls, and the inside of the house was warm. Their son was born in August of 1884, during the kind of summer night that the Llano Estacado occasionally produced, warm and still with the stars so bright and close they seemed to belong to the land rather than the sky. Dorothy Faraday was there, having driven out in the evening and stayed through the night with the competent, calm efficiency of a woman who had assisted at several births in her years in Cutter's Fork. He was born at dawn, when the first light was coming through the east-facing kitchen window and moving through the house in that warm, angled way of summer mornings, and he announced his arrival with a volume and specificity that suggested he had opinions about the world and intended to express them from the start. Marshall held him for the first time with the total, overwhelmed care of a man given something irreplaceable and aware of it in every part of himself. Bessie watched from the bed, exhausted and more awake than she had ever been in her life, and she thought that this was what home looked like from the inside, not the structure. Not the east-facing kitchen or the well-set fence posts or the yellow roses along the east fence. The people inside it. They named him James. James Thomas Haskins, for no ancestor in particular, simply because the name suited him from the first moment they said it aloud and looked at him, and he seemed, in the mysterious way of newborns, to agree. Obie held the baby that first morning with the shaking, reverent hands of an old man experiencing something he had not expected to be given, and he cried again, and this time he did not deny it. By the time James was walking and providing his parents with the particular kind of exhausted entertainment that accompanies a determined toddler, Bessie had begun to feel the particular fullness and the particular restlessness that she had come to recognize as the shape her life took when it was going well. A fullness that wanted to grow, a restlessness that was not dissatisfaction but expansion. She told Marshall one evening that she had been thinking about expanding the cattle operation. She had been watching the market, reading the reports that came through the Cutter's Fork paper and the more detailed ones she received from a contact in Abilene, and she had identified a pattern in the autumn pricing that suggested an opportunity if they timed their sales differently. He listened. He asked questions. He pushed back on one assumption she had made about the winter feed costs, and she reconsidered it, and he was right about that one, and she told him so, and he did not make anything of it except to nod and move on to the next question. They were a good team. That was the thing she had not allowed herself to imagine when she was managing alone. That partnership could be this: two people thinking together, neither diminishing the other, both made larger by the combination. They expanded the herd. The following spring, Bessie discovered she was expecting again. She told Dorothy first, because she and Dorothy had that kind of friendship, and Dorothy hugged her with a warmth that was uncomplicated and true. She told Marshall that evening, and he looked at her with the same overwhelmed happiness he had shown the first time, not diminished by its repetition, but deepened by it. Their second child was a girl, born in the late autumn of 1886, arrived in the world with considerably more composure than her brother had, quiet and watchful from the first minutes with dark eyes that were unmistakably her father's. They named her Elena, not as an obligation or a memorial, but because the name had always sat between them as something that had mattered, and when the baby arrived and they looked at her, and the name presented itself, it felt not like a ghost being honored but like something living being carried forward. Marshall looked at Bessie when they said the name aloud together for the first time, and she looked at him, and neither of them had to say anything about what it meant because they both already knew. Eleanor Haskins grew up to be precisely as direct and observant as her dark eyes suggested. James, for his part, turned out to be a talker, following his father around the property from the age of 2 with a constant stream of observations and questions that Marshall answered with patient thoroughness, until Bessie had to intervene on behalf of his sanity. The years moved through the Haskins place the way good years do, with a rhythm that is not excitement but is not ordinary either. Seasons of work and seasons of rest, and the accumulated daily pleasures of a life built on a solid foundation. The yellow roses along the east fence bloomed every June without fail. The creek ran clean through the southern edge of the property. The kitchen garden produced enough to share with the Caldwell family next door, whose children and the Haskins children grew up in the easy, constant proximity of neighboring families on the open land. Bessie's hair went from the warm brown of their early years together to something threaded with silver at the temples by the time Eleanor was old enough for school, and she wore the silver the way she wore everything, without apology and with the quiet certainty of someone who has made their peace with time. Marshall's face deepened in the way that weather and a full life deepen a face, the lines at his eyes more pronounced, his hands showing the history of all the work they had done, and Bessie found, with an honesty that was one of the better gifts of a long acquaintance, that she thought him more beautiful at 42 than she had thought him at 32, which was already a good starting point. They sat on the porch on an October evening when James was 12 and Eleanor was 8 and Obie was 83 and still refusing to be treated as anything other than fully functional, and the land stretched out in the dusk in every direction with the comfortable vastness that the Llano Estacado bestowed on everything within its enormous reach. Bessie said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" He said. "Tell me," she said. "That gate post, the first one. The rotted cedar one that was leaning into the road when you came the first time." He said, "I think about that post too," she said. "That post was me. The rotted cedar post leaning at a 20-degree angle about to fall over." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That is one way to see it." She said, "What is another way?" He said, "I see a post that was standing. It was worn and under pressure and had been through a lot of weather without enough support, but it was standing. And the grain of the wood was good. The grain was always good." She looked at him. He looked back at her. She said, "You are a remarkably consistent man." He said, "I know what I think." She reached across and took his hand, and they sat on the porch of the house on the gentle rise above the creek, while the October evening came down around them, and the yellow roses had finished their season and stood dormant along the east fence, and in the house behind them, their children made the sounds of children who are completely inside their own world and do not yet know how lucky they are, and Obie was in his room reading the newspaper by lamplight, and would deny any suggestion that he had fallen asleep over it. She said, "I am glad you fixed the gate post." He said, "So am I," she said. "I am glad I finally asked you inside." He said, "So am I. Though I would have kept coming regardless." She said, "I know, that was the thing, Marshall. That was always the thing, that you kept coming." He squeezed her hand. The stars were beginning to appear over the flat land, first one and then another, and then the whole enormous abundance of a Texas sky that had learned nothing about being modest, and Bessie Haskins sat on her porch with her husband's hand in hers and felt, all the way through, the particular gravity of a good life. Not a perfect life. Not a life without its seasons of fear and difficulty, and the residual ache of old losses. But a life that was genuinely hers, built deliberately and honestly, and with more courage than she had known she possessed when she was a woman standing on porch steps telling a stranger to be done before dark. She had been brave enough to say his name. She had been brave enough to open the door. And he had been patient enough to wait for her to get there, fixing what was broken month by month with the steady, certain hands of a man who believed in the grain of the wood, even when the wood itself was not sure it was worth believing in. The roses would bloom again in June. They always did.